Facebook, Instagram e WhatsApp são os apps da Meta que ajudam milhares de pessoas a fazer acontecer. A Lara começou a cuidar da saúde. O André começou uma profissão nova.
Saindo porção de coxinha.
E a Olivia fez uma festa surpresa.
Surpresa!
Pro seu gato.
Parabéns!
Fazer acontecer com os apps da Meta tá na sua mão.
Cliente Nubank Ultravioleta tem saldo compartilhado para dividir as contas da casa com a sua família. Conheça Nubank Ultravioleta, como deveria ser.
On the new podcast, American Criminal, you'll learn about the fraud, theft, and murder that marks the dark side of the American dream. Like the Menendez murders, was it two greedy kids who killed their parents for money, or is there more? Listen to American Criminal wherever you get your podcasts.
What is up, everyone? Welcome to There Can Only Be One, the podcast that puts together the all-star best of playlists of your favorite bands and artists. When we talk about some of the greatest bands of all time, clearly we have to be talking about, who could we be talking about today? We've already talked about Def Leppard. We've already talked about Metallica. And of course, we've already talked about Anthrax, but I get, personal choice, but I get. Today, we are definitely talking about one of the hands down, no arguments whatsoever, greatest bands of all time, Creedence Clearwater Revival. And here to join us for this little sojourn back into the 60s and 70s is Lyle Robichaud. Welcome back to the show. Lyle, how you doing, man?
I am doing great, Jason. So excited to be back. Can't wait to cover what is a really big favorite of mine, really big favorite of my family's. Who doesn't love CCR?
I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who actually does not like CCR. And if they do, I don't even know. I can't even understand why anyone would. I get people not liking every song in an artist's discography, and that's perfectly fine. But you have to think at some point, at least one song from their admittedly brief but very impactful discography has affected everyone somewhere at some point.
And that's exactly it. There's not anybody that can go out, listen to their greatest hits album, the anthology album. If you can listen to that and not find one song that you absolutely love or tap your toe to, I don't think you have any rhythm. It's just impossible. They cover so much ground in such a small amount of time. Burn hot and bright and burn out quick, I guess, was the strategy, and it worked to perfection here.
You're not joking on the burn out quick, because they put out a lot of good material in a real short span of time.
Really short span of time. I think it was all of their not basic, I shouldn't say that, their legendary albums, all of their discography came out between, I believe, 1969 and 79. So you had about a 10-year span there where you had one of the greatest bands of all time. And when we get into the albums and you realize that they put out that much quality in that small of a time frame, not even just that, but 3 of these albums that would go on to become absolute classics came out in 1969, just that 1 year.
Oh, yeah.
So it's incredible. It's incredible to think that much great music was released in such a small amount of time by the same people.
Oh, yeah. We often talk about the 3-album run, like that stretch in an artist's discography where it's album after album after album, 3 albums in a row where it is all killer, no filler. You have to think that the concept of the 3-album run probably comes from Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a formula that people have been trying to replicate since the 70s when they did it.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, is when you think about it, more often than not these days, you have, bands that may take three years between albums. Here, we had 3 albums in a year from the same band.
And all of them turned into classics. If another band did this, you see some bands who do have a really crazy release schedule and will put out every year like clockwork, there will be new work. but not all of it's critically acclaimed. In fact, you're an outlier if you can pump up tunes this quick and all of them be really well received, and not just well received, but go on to be timeline marks in classic rock history.
Yeah, I think we've teased our listeners enough. So let's get into the nitty-gritty on this, and let's set out the rules here. We are about to go through the 7-album studio discography of Creedence Clearwater Revival. It should be noted, we are not, as always, we're not covering live albums, we're not covering compilations. We're also not covering their time known as the Blue Velvets or as Vision and the Gollywogs, and we're also not going to be covering John Fogerty's solo material. That's for another episode somewhere down the road. But we're going to start in July of 1968 and the release of their self-titled debut album. The band at this point, of course, is John and Tom Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford. The album hit number 52 in the US and is certified platinum. There were 3 singles off of this one. Susie Q hit number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100. Now, we did have some shout-outs from the interwebs. Of course, Brian Colburn, our good friend over at My Weekly Mixtape, chimed in with the entire discography, so we'll be shouting him out throughout the show. But Brian ended up picking I Put a Spell on You. But off of the debut CCR album, what did you go with?
See, here's the thing. I went with a bit of an outlier, but it's an outlier that if you're a fan of CCR, you know that this song should be getting more recognition. I went with Porterville. Now, the reason I did this, it is very much a harder song for CCR's catalog. It's got more of a Led Zeppelin-y vibe to it. I always said it sounded like if Led Zeppelin grew up in West Virginia. This is what would happen. And I absolutely love Porterville. Obviously, Susie Q, Put a Spell on You became classics. They're also covers, though. So this is their first best original work, in my mind.
It's funny because, I mean, obviously I knew the CCR songs that, get a lot of radio play and ones that I have played live personally myself. And it's very interesting to see just how many of their songs were actually covers of standards and the like. And there's a few songs in here where I was like, I can't believe they did a cover of that one, but I can't even believe that. In one case, I was like, I can't even believe that's a real song. And we'll get to that one a little bit later. Off of this one, though, I'm actually going with a song that was actually from their Gollywogs era. Originally titled Walking on the Water, they retitled it Walk on the Water. There's a good breakdown in this. There's a lot of good head bobbing in it and lots of dynamics, because keep in mind, this is also the second longest song on the album, right behind Susie Q. This is 4:35, but I think there's enough dynamics in this song that carries it through that whole way.
Yeah, and you'll see that as a pattern going forward. They do like a long song with a lot of bridges, instrumental breaks that last a very long time, and they pull it off well, which also isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. And you're right, a lot of covers from places you wouldn't necessarily expect the covers to come from. And I think the reason that so many people think that these are CCR songs and don't realize they're covers is because this band is, in fact, so old that a lot of these songs have been kind of lost to time other than the CCR version.
And the funny thing, too, and I'm sure there are people out there who are probably in the same boat as I am, in that you knew the songs, you knew the big hits. I don't know if prior to preparing for this episode, if I had ever actually purposely sat down and listened to a CCR album front to back, yet many, many, many of these songs, I'm like, yeah, no, I know that one, I've heard that one all over the place. It's amazing how many of these songs became part of regular musical lexicon on the radio just by the sheer talent and bigness that CCR was.
And off of one of the most recognizable, interesting, and still to this day, clean-sounding, unaltered voices in John Fogerty. That power train that he's got inside of him that just lets him belt out those long notes, and just in the way he does it, no one has ever seeped the music in their voice like John Fogerty does.
Oh, I mean, so good that he was sued for sounding too much like himself. So I'm sorry,
Crazy.
I still laugh at that whole story, but
the whole legal stuff is almost makes a joke of the band. If it was any other band that didn't have this much quality to them, I don't think they would survive that kind of thing. But the legacy lives on because the music is too good to get mired up in all of the legal troubles, which could be their own 2-hour podcast in itself.
Oh, I'm sure, like, you probably have some of those true crime podcasts. It's like, we now look into the case of a man who was sued for sounding like himself and the sordid history behind it. You know, there's a show that's out there that's going to
There has to be
like that.
There has to be, and if there isn't, there should be.
Exactly. You know, I can't even figure out what the song title would be or the podcast title would be. But if there is a podcast out there that examines the court trials and tribulations of CCR, please let us know online at Only One Cast. And I'm curious. I would actually listen to that show.
I would love to hear a timeline of the events, because as big of a fan as I am, there's been so much that's happened between the band and John and the representation of the band and who owns the rights to this song and who owns the rights to that song. I would love to see an organized timeline of events and where everything sits now.
Yeah. CCR didn't exactly put to rest the idea of brothers in a band actually working out in the end. You know, you could mention the Gallagher brothers, of course, from Oasis. You could mention the Robinson brothers from Black Crowes, but it really all kind of starts from here.
Yeah, it's difficult. Working with family's hard anyway, let alone in an atmosphere like this. I think one of the few times where it worked out was AC/DC. The Young brothers were friends, I think, up until the very end when Malcolm passed away. But no, it doesn't work out very often, does it?
I mean, you also have RJ and Lizzie Hale in Hailstorm, and that works out really, really well. So, yeah, you
Great
can have
band.
siblings in the band, absolutely. For CCR, it didn't quite work. But let's move on to January 15th, 1969, and the release of Bayou Country. The album hit number 7 and is double platinum in the U.S. There was one single off of this one. Proud Mary hit number 2 on the Hot 100 and actually hit number 1 in Austria. Brian Colburn went with Born on the Bayou. But off of this one, what did you go with?
I did go with Born on the Bayou just because I kind of like the slower, more bluesy riffs to it. That's always my favorite CCR songs, are usually kind of the slower tempoed ones. But you can't really look past Proud Mary and how important it was for the band. That was the first really huge hit. A lot of people don't realize it's a song about a steam engine. It's about a ferry that goes across the bay back and forth. You can hear that once you listen to it, but it's not made 100% obvious in the song. And that caught like wildfire. This is kind of where the magic began. This is really where you saw them form into what they would be going forward, which is a bunch of people that have never been to a bayou encapsulating the feel and the vibe of living on the bayou perfectly, which I still think is amazing.
Speaking of covers too, by the way, Good Golly, Miss Molly is also a cover on this album. Again, dipping into the covers catalog here. I ended up going with Proud Mary. It is really, really hard to sit there and take a look at this and go, I mean, obviously it is a CCR song, but gun to your head, you have to choose which version is the better version of Proud Mary. This, the original, or the Ike and Tina Turner?
That's hard. That's really hard. I might have to go with Ike and Tina Turner because Proud Mary is my favorite CCR song for sure. That's why I picked Born on the Bayou before it. So I think I would probably have to go with Ike and Tina Turner, but get them to sing any song and say it's not the best version of it when they were in their heyday.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is that, it is two very different takes on the song.
Oh,
like the Ike and Tina Turner version is an absolute, foot stomper, dance floor. Like there's power behind that song. And to me, Proud Mary is, kind of like that the strumming sound that I equate to CCR. There's a lot of guitar work that I relate more to John Fogerty's solo stuff later on down the road. This, to me, Proud Mary, by the way, this is my pick. The strumming CCR song sound, that you can play anywhere from a club to by a campfire. This is what CCR is to me.
Yes, and that kind of reverberates through the whole album too, because there's another really good track on there called Bootleg that has that same campfire sing song, like really easy to pick up and play, but very difficult to make it sound as good as the original as it does here. That kind of reverberates through the whole album, but that does make sense. Proud Mary put them on the map. If it wasn't for that song, there wouldn't be the rest of this incredible discography.
Oh yeah. But I will say Bootleg was probably the second pick for me off of this album, but yeah, Proud Mary for sure. We now move on to our second album of 1969, released August 7th of that year. It's Green River. The album hit number 1 on the Billboard album charts and is triple platinum. There were 2 singles off of this one. Both Bad Moon Rising and Green River hit number 2 on the Hot 100. However, Bad Moon Rising also hit number 1 in New Zealand and the UK. Brian and Robert Buckles off of Threads chimed in with Lodi, and also on Threads, the Metal Institute of Thrashology went with Bad Moon Rising. So off of Green River, what did you go with?
This is where it gets hard. This is where it gets really, really difficult to pick one. But the people have good taste. I went with Lodi. It's just an absolute classic, but man, is it a tie between a couple. Bad Moon Rising obviously became one of their staples too. It's been used in so much pop culture stuff now that it's become a legend. Tombstone Shadow, also a really good song. But for me, the one that just sticks the most is Lodi.
Lodi's good. I've played Lodi live. It's a fun one. I've also played Bad Moon Rising live. And of course, I'm going to go with that one. There is one of those things where the more you play a song live, the more you feel attached to it. You know, it's no longer just a passive listening experience because you sit there, you learn it, you break it down, you feel it, and then you play it live, and then you get to feel, you know, the crowd reaction when you do play it. I guarantee you, anytime any band plays Bad Moon Rising, no matter what kind of crowd and what kind of bar you're in, people are going to toe tap and sing along, and it's a crowd pleaser every time. That also being said, confession, more often times than not, if I feel like, you know, it's one of those nights where you can have a little bit of fun with the crowd, I have on multiple occasions sang the line, "There's a bathroom on the right," just to see who's paying attention.
I've never heard that done before, but I absolutely love it.
Oh, you knew I was going to do something like that. But yeah,
that's incredible.
It's funny too, because like people will sit there and go, did they sing the song wrong? And one or two, you know, faces will sit there and go, yeah, they did it. Bathroom on the right. We get it. Silly band. Because
it is sometimes John does fall into Brian Johnson territory where he sings so well only he can understand himself. There are definitely some misheard lyrics to be had with a lot of these songs.
Bob Dylan is translated by Tom Petty.
That would just be, I think that would just be white noise, wouldn't it? That would just be too filtered.
You never know. You never know. But the thing is too, it's like there are often misheard lyrics, and you could, you know, make a massive list of songs of misheard lyric songs. Bad Moon Rising isn't exactly, I think, a misheard lyric, but it's just one of those things where, you just know, and it becomes fun.
Yes.
You know, it's like the call and response when you start playing Billy Idol's Moni Moni.
And it's just everyone guessing at that point in the crowd.
Well, there will be some people who sing along with the more popular version, and one person who will sit there and say, "Hey, rubber ducky, get wet, get soaked," and you know that person has kids.
That's it. Oh, that's amazing.
Also, if the bathroom's on the left when you sing that song lyric, you really confuse people who sit there and go, no, it's stage right. It's stage right.
You can make it work. You can stretch it however way you want.
Exactly. Our third album of 1969 is Willie and the Poor Boys, released October 29th of that year. The album hit number 3 on the Billboard charts and is double platinum. Both Down on the Corner and Fortunate Son hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. Brian went with Fortunate Son, but off of Willie and the Poor Boys, what'd you go with?
This is another one where it's extremely difficult because there's two CCR songs that I also think are very highly underrated. Midnight Special and It Came Out of the Sky. It Came Out of the Sky is amazing, but for the best one off Willie and the Poor Boys, I did go with Midnight Special. Obviously, Fortunate Son is probably the best and most well-recognized protest song of all time, made in response to the Vietnam War. But Midnight Special for me just hits all the right notes and really plays into Fogerty's voice well.
Oh, absolutely. To me, when I was listening to this album, it really came down to two songs. And that's Fortunate Son, of course, which is one of the biggest songs of their entire career, and Down on the Corner. And if you wonder where Willie and the Poor Boys, the title came from, guess where it came from? It came from this song. I ended up going with Down on the Corner, but I think it's one of those things where this album, and then this is just a me personal thing, each side of the album starts off really strong. Side A starts with Down on the Corner. Side B starts with Fortunate Son. And it's really hard for either side to come back after hitting so hard and so well with those first songs.
And it's true. That's actually one of the things that I had written down as well. It's if you flip the disc, that's it. Like you get the grand. It's almost like it's written in reverse. The track list is in reverse. You should have them at the end. It's hard to follow this album. Like this would be an album any other band would have a really difficult time coming up after, because anybody could come at me with any one of these songs and say it's the best from Willie and the Poor Boys, and I wouldn't necessarily call them wrong. This is really when they were hitting their stride, and everything coming out was quality. So it's hard to, when everything's good, it's really hard to pick the best one.
I mean, you could take the best songs from the 3 albums of 1969, 2 or 3 from each, and it would be maybe one of the best greatest hits CDs in recent memory.
Especially coming out in the same calendar year. Like it's unheard of today. I don't think anybody today, first of all, could have the wherewithal to get 3 albums out, because the process is just so arduous now. And if they did have this much material that charts and sticks, it would be unheard of. It would be all over the place if this happened today.
Yeah, and that's 3 studio albums. We're not talking about like 3 albums out of a collection of bootleg recordings from a tour, which I know some artists have done. I know Tori Amos has done that, where you have an entire tour, and each show has its own CD, which is really, really cool when you think about it. But we're talking 3 studio albums, and you have to wonder, what if rather than do 3 albums in 1 year, they did 1 album with all the best songs on it? How big would that album have been?
It would have blown the doors off. But I think this speaks to the work ethic a bit too, because this is also back when you couldn't just get the newest album digitally, right? This is 3 albums packaged, delivered, sent to record stores, charted on paper. Like this was back when the process was crazy to do. So when you think about it, the layers of it and the undertaking that must have been, as well as just having the songwriting ability to fill 3 albums worth of material this good, it all comes together, and it's unheard of now. You could have a lot of people on SoundCloud saying a lot of things, and yeah, there's a lot of like independent music being made really quick, and that's amazing. But to do it at this level of quality is scary almost.
And when you realize that John Fogerty wrote the majority, or basically all of the original songs that were on these 3 albums, you can almost understand why there were covers in there.
Yeah, because they knew they could do these covers extremely well. So they knew they had the nuggets from John. They knew they had a really good sound that could be lended to songs that, like I said, were kind of lost to time, could be brought back into the consciousness a little bit. And it worked. The formula was right there. Unfortunately, it was a really quick burning formula, like we said at the beginning.
To quote Neil Young, it's better to burn out than to fade away.
American Criminal is a new true crime podcast from the studio behind American Scandal and American History Tellers. Every week, you'll fall deeper into the riveting stories of the country's most clever, craven, and cruel criminals. Fraud, theft, murder, and worse. Whatever the case, whoever the criminal, you don't know the whole story until now. The debut season tackles one of the most sensational cases of the 20th century, the Menendez murders. In 1989, young Lyle and Eric Menendez brutally shot their own parents. Prosecutors and the press said it was a multi-million-dollar inheritance that led 2 greedy rich kids to murder. But the picture-perfect facade this Hollywood family built hid troubling abuse. Could these teenagers have been driven to kill? Or was it even in self-defense? Listen now. Go to AmericanCriminal.com or search for and follow American Criminal wherever you get your podcasts.
We now move into 1970 and the release of Cosmo's Factory, released July 8th of that year. Arguably their biggest album of all time. The album hit number 1 in the US and multiple other countries. It is 4 times platinum in the US, silver in the UK, and gold in Finland. Of the singles that were released, Traveling Band, Who'll Stop the Rain, Looking Out My Back Door, and Long As I Can See the Light all hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. But Traveling Band hit number 1 in Belgium and the Netherlands. Who'll Stop the Rain, number 1 in Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Up Around the Bend, number 1 in Australia, Canada, and the Netherlands. Run Through the Jungle, number 1 in Canada. Looking Out My Back Door, number 1 on the Cashbox charts, and in Australia, Austria, Canada, and Norway. Long As I Can See the Light, number 1 in Australia, Austria, and Canada. This album, if you haven't figured it out by now how good this album is, the album is inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2014. Brian Colburn picked I Heard It Through the Grapevine. This album, front to back, like arguably their best album ever.
Arguably one of the best albums ever. Most definitely in the conversation for the top 3 of my favorite albums of all time. And the quality can't be matched. If you have this physically, you have one of the best of its kind. Every single song is amazing. Every single song is an honorable mention because they're all good, all the way, like when you started up from Ramble Tamble, all the way to the end, As Long as I Can See the Light. But the best song on this album is Heard It Through the Grapevine. To me, this is a perfect song, as close as you can get to it. If it exists, it's Heard It Through the Grapevine by CCR. It's long, but it doesn't feel long. And as soon as it's done, you want to start it over again. It's when I'm on the subway here in the city traveling somewhere, there's a 90% chance this song is on the playlist that I'm listening to.
You say that it's one of the best albums of all time. I want to put this into perspective here. In 2003, Rolling Stone put out a list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. This album sat at number 265 on that list. In 2020, when they re-released and re-ranked that list, this album sits at number 413 on the list of all-time greatest albums. That seems an injustice to this album.
I think it does, because when you think of the staying power of some of these songs, you think of Travelin' Van, Looking Out My Back Door, Run Through the Jungle, Up Around the Bend, Who'll Stop the Rain, Heard It Through the Grapevine, all on the same album. It sounds like a greatest hits album, but it's not. That was the studio release. And it's crazy to think about it. I've seen that same list of greatest albums of all time, and there are so many that are so much higher that only have 2 songs that hit number 1 and went big, and the rest of the album is kind of forgotten about. This album kind of can't be forgotten about because most of the songs are on the greatest hits album too. You could just take this, copy paste it over, and it's a greatest hits album as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's like celebrating that the highest selling album in U.S. history, if memory serves, is the Eagles' greatest hits. But that's not really fair because it's a greatest hits.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily put that in the running. I want to know what the number 1 highest selling. It's just the single album. Of course, the greatest hits are going to sell a lot. You have all of the best thrown into the soup. It's like, it just doesn't make any sense to put that up against something like this, where this is the studio release. It's one of my top 3. It always will be. I've been singing this album's praises since I was like 10 years old, and I'll continue to do so.
For the record, in the States, the highest selling original album is Michael Jackson's Thriller.
It's Thriller. I figured it was. I know Thriller, Back in Black are up there fighting with each other like dragons at all times. I remember when I worked at HMV, I used to keep a pretty close tab on it because I was convinced AC/DC was going to surpass it someday. I just wanted that little victory, but Thriller is Thriller. It's really hard to beat that.
I mean, the other thing too, and you have to put this into perspective, right? If you're taking a look at ranking the albums based on album sales, this album came out in 1970. And you cannot compare a 1970 sales, listing in comparison to Thriller, which is the all-time original album sales leader, and then compare it to albums that are out today where no one buys them, they just stream them.
You don't have to physically go to your store and pick it up. That's what people lose here. I think there's something lost there with physical media. I love physical media. I have a vinyl collection, but that's the thing. The album sales for these are so impressive because people had to leave their home, go to their local record store, try to find one of the few copies that was probably left of this when it was coming out, because it's not like you could just order more and the next shipment comes in on Tuesday. It's crazy to think about the gap of the work ethic in music back then to make this much quality and music now to make this much quality.
Before I get to my pick for this album, I need to share my little freak out moment in this, because we know I'm a geek, right? We've established.
I didn't say it, but I think it's a safe space because I'm pretty sure I am one too.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm pretty sure I have self-confessed on numerous episodes my high levels of geekdom. So when I listened to this album, and again, this is the first time ever actually listening to this album, although I'm pretty sure I had heard almost every single song on here as, on the radio or however. And then one song comes on. And Lyle, I'm not kidding when I say I lost my when I heard this song, because up until this moment, I'm like, No. That's not a real song. It's not a real song. Ooby Dooby.
I knew it was going to be that.
And the minute I heard this song, I could picture one Mr. Zephram Cochrane dancing around by a jukebox from Star Trek First Contact.
So you thought it was just from the show?
See, I thought because, let's be honest, Ooby Dooby is really kind of nonsense lyrics.
It is. And it's not at all one of the songs you think about when you think of CCR.
To me, and again, this is how my brain was working when I was watching that film. Like, this has got to be a nonsense song that they took a standard blues riff and, put some nonsense lyrics on it so they didn't get, copyright hit or whatever. Because you can't really copyright a standard blues riff. And then I realized now that was the Roy Orbison version of the song Ooby Dooby. So CCR's version is a cover. Roy Orbison's version is also a cover. The song was actually written by Dick Penner and Wade Moore. And I'm telling you, I had a big old smile when I heard Ooby Dooby. Not my pick, but I had to point that out because I'm a geek.
And it's crazy how many of these songs have seeped into pop culture, even the stuff that isn't big. I've heard songs on the radio before. I know Tombstone Shadow was in a movie, and I'd heard it in the movie, and I had that same reaction of like, I've heard this before. I know that's not nonsense that was just made for this. Sure enough, CCR, there's so many pop culture things that if Fortunate Son alone, the counter must be incredibly high of how many things Fortunate Son has been in by itself. But they pop up everywhere, and that's really funny that because it is nonsense lyrics. It makes complete sense that you would think it was just made up for the show.
Oh, yeah. And so, honestly, if you are a Star Trek fan at all, you hear the song, your first image is Zephram Cochrane drunkenly dancing around while Deanna Troi is completely passed out and Will Riker is basically face-palming. Not to give anything away to the movie, but there you go. No, my pick off this one is Traveling Band. And maybe it's because of the fun bass lines in this. Maybe because it's just a good rocker. Or maybe being in a cover band, you realize just how much you associate to the lyrics of Traveling Band as you go from, town to town and you play your sets and whatnot. And there's something really relatable about being in a, for lack of a better term, working band, going out there playing shows that Traveling Band kind of hits.
And it's true. That's what I was thinking when you were explaining. I was like, he's in a traveling band. That's why it hits good for him. He lives the song. And it is. John had a really good way of storytelling from a really relatable standpoint. And that's like how I said earlier, so many people from the places he would sing about loved his music, even though he was from Southern California and had never actually been to a bayou. So it's something he knows about in traveling around and singing, and the do's and don'ts of, playing the London Music Hall and that great documentary that came out about them. It makes sense that one of their best songs would be him describing his own life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like when, Johnny Cash's I've Been Everywhere comes on the radio and you sit there and you wait for your town to be mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. It's true.
It's like watching Romper Room and waiting for your name to be called.
Yeah, or when you're in the small town New Year's Eve festival in New Brunswick and Newfoundland, anyway, they do this. And they have all the small villages rolling across the bottom of the screen. You're staying up. There it is. There's us. There's our little slice of nowhere.
Right. Or, and I'm going to put a real Canadian spin on this. Dear people of Newfoundland, if you have not heard the song A Night on Dildo by the Arrogant Worms, go listen to it, because basically your entire province is listed in that song. Because there are some fun names of places in Newfoundland.
Oh, yes. They're their own country. We should just give them they really should just get their own sovereignty at this point.
Well, they are their own time zone too, so.
Yeah, they've got their whole thing going on.
And it's only a half-hour difference. Just to make it different.
Just to be different and just to say we have it.
We now move on to Pendulum, released December 9th, 1970. The album hit number 5 in the US and also hit number 1 in Australia, Finland, and Norway. It is platinum in the States and gold in Finland. Of the singles that were released on here, Have You Ever Seen the Rain hit number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 in Canada. And Hey Tonight hit number 1 in Canada, Belgium, and Denmark. Brian Colburn went with Have You Ever Seen the Rain. I can't disagree with that pick. at all because A, it's my pick, and B, having played that song multiple nights and multiple shows in multiple cities and a traveling band, have you ever seen the rain? I've never seen this song not go over.
It is a karaoke classic, I think is what you would call it. Everybody's heard this song at a bar at one point in time. If you live in Canada anyway, every bar I've been to where there's karaoke or a live cover band at a pub, if it's not metal, if it's a cover band that just does top 40, they're probably going to whip this out at some point. I actually went with Hey Tonight just because I like it a little bit more. Maybe I've heard, have you ever seen the rain too many times? That's just starting to grain on me. I went with Hey Tonight, but obviously the honorable mention has to go with that. This is the start, unfortunately, though, of a very short but noticeable slide for the band. This is where they started to lose a little bit of steam. This is where the arguing started to come up between the two brothers and stuff. Behind the scenes was getting a little bit dicey, and you can kind of tell because this is the first album that isn't cover to cover unskippable music.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, it had to happen eventually. And to see it happen here in their second to last outing, it's a short but very noticeable slide.
Yeah. And it is, to note, the last album with Tom Fogerty working on it.
Yes.
I just remember playing a show, and you were actually at that show at the Rose and Crown.
Oh, yes.
And we got to third set, and you know, we had some dancers in that set. We had a lot of dance music, and one of the songs that was early on in the set was Have You Ever Seen the Rain? I remember our singer looking at me going, we're going to play this? I'm like, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. We start playing it. The entire bar starts singing along. Like everyone in the bar singing along. And it was one of those, see, I told you, this song, no matter what, this song is going to go over.
In the words of Will Ferrell, it gets the people going.
I mentioned earlier, to quote Neil Young, it's better to burn out than to fade away. And unfortunately, we get to the fade away moment. And Mardi Gras, released April 11th, 1972. As mentioned before, this album was only John Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford. The album hit number 12 in the US and is certified gold. Now, it should be noted, of the 10 songs on this list, John Fogerty, who had been writing pretty much anything that wasn't a cover up to this point, only wrote 3 of the songs and only sang on 4 of them. The rest of the duties were up to Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, including lead vocals. Sweet Hitchhiker, which was one of those John Fogerty songs, actually hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 in Canada. That's actually Brian's pick, and it's also my pick as well. What did you go with off of Mardi Gras?
Unfortunately, it's a little slim pickings here, and it is Sweet Hitchhiker is the best one because that's CCR. It's one of the songs on here that still sounds like the band. It's no offense to any of the other members. Obviously, they're part of history too, but without John Fogerty's voice, you don't have much of CCR. That's just how it is. He was the front man, and he was kind of the beating heart of all of it. There's some good stuff on here besides Sweet Hitchhiker. I really like Sail Away. Door to Door is a bit underrated in my mind. I think that could go on a compilation or two. If anybody hasn't listened to that one, go back. But the album itself is very, very skippable. This is a non-stuck landing in every stretch of the word. The fact that there was so much power at the beginning of this, and now we get to the end, and it very much goes out with a bit of a whimper with Mardi Gras. It's sad to see backstage politics kind of tear something apart, but that's exactly what happened here. And for a band that started out so hot, they end pretty cold.
It's funny because of your kind of like secondary choice songs, going with Door to Door and Stay Away or Sail Away, you went with 2 songs that were written and sung by Stu Cook. For me, my backups were actually Need Someone to Hold and What Are You Gonna Do? And those were both sung by Clifford. Like this, it's funny because Stu Cook, I actually have it written down here. Please don't let Stu Cook sing.
Yeah. Just the memo. If you guys can get that memo.
A little late for that.
A little late. But it's true. Without John, it's hard. It's hard to even think of it as CCR without that voice.
And that's the thing. Like when you were on the show and we were talking about Kiss, of course they are famous for, you know, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons trading off on vocals throughout each album, you know, and occasionally letting Ace and Peter sing, right? Here, I think it would have been one thing if Doug Clifford and Stu Cook had sung different songs throughout the 7 albums, But this is very much a, John Fogerty seemingly, wiping his hands of everything, saying, "You f***ers do it."
Yep. Basically, that's kind of exactly what it was. And not even just that, but if they would have had an album after this, if there would have been an album where they did this, where every member of the band kind of got their stuff in and everyone got a 2 or 3 songs, then they went back to the formula, then that was the last one, it would make sense. But the fact that it's the final album, it stinks of there were problems here. Even if you didn't know about the band, if you aren't familiar with music history and like aren't in the know of the goings on between the brothers, if you listened just all of it in a row and you got to this, there would be a noticeable something happened here. What happened? Somebody did not cook here. What went on?
Well,
And it's so noticeable.
Stu cooked because he's Stu Cook.
But he didn't cook at all.
It's funny because in 1976, John Fogerty was doing an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, and he says, yeah, Creedence made 6 albums because he doesn't, and nor should anyone else, count Mardi Gras. That kind of gives you an idea of his mindset about this album and the band at this time. And it's unfortunate because, had Pendulum been the last one, you could almost sit there and say that the legacy can be untarnished. Mardi Gras is like a sore thumb.
It is. And it's such a shame it's at the end because you're 100% right. If Mardi Gras wouldn't have happened, there'd be an argument to say this is one of the most perfect discographies of all time. When it comes down to like studio releases with staying power and hits. But because of Mardi Gras, it just skews the whole list. Like it's an outlier of outliers.
And that's like, I wonder if there is a band ever that has had a perfect discography of at least a number of albums. Because at 7 albums, you had the ability to have a perfect discography. You were one shy, and that one shy does. And again, that's not to diss any of the songs on here, because there are some good songs. Like, again, Sweet Hitchhiker, of course, everyone has picked. You and I have both mentioned a couple of songs each, but it's not meeting up to the rest of them. And you're right. Had it been in the middle of the pack or early on in their career where they were still finding their sound, maybe a different story. But you're right. It does feel like an absolute whimper to go out on.
This sounds like what Bayou Country and Creedence Clearwater Revival, the first album, probably should have sounded like. It sounds like a first try. It sounds like we're figuring it out, just exactly as you said. And the easiest way I can explain it is listen to Cosmos Factory, then listen to this back to back.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because when you think about it, those early albums in a band's career can really be where you're finding your sound and, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, how to, take advantage of the tools that you have available. I mean, you take a look at a band like Bon Jovi, right? And they didn't really get big, until Slippery When Wet. But you still had 2 albums even before that.
And it's true. There's almost the forgotten discographies of the before they were famouses, right? So it's interesting when something like this happens and their first album is The Arrival, because they were quite popular even after that first album. And going back to your question of is there any band that has a perfect discography? This might be the closest you come. One of the closest you could find, I'd think, because even the greatest bands of all time have a stinker or 2 in there. We talked about that with Kiss and AC/DC, my favorite band of all time. It is not invincible. There have been some forgettable discs there that you don't necessarily have to go back to. Guns for Hire. There's just several things you have to take into account but it's also to be said that those bands had legacies that are going on over 50 years now.
Yeah.
Maybe in the benefit of hindsight, it was good that they burned out so quick because this remains pristine. If they would have gone on until for 20 years or 30 years or made it up into the modern day, maybe they would have been tarnished. Maybe the rest of the albums after Pendulum were doomed to be terrible. Maybe this saved us from a horrible fate.
Yeah. And again, this is not to, disparage Mardi Gras by any stretch of the imagination, but you're right. It is. They had clearly gotten to a point, and this was the outcome. And it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. But at least we got a 7th album out of CCR. Take that for what it is. But we've now come to the end of the show. So Lyle, before we get away, it's time. So please remind our listeners what songs you picked, and from that list, if there can only be one, what's your go?
This is the really hard one of these. So Mardi Gras was Sweet Hitchhiker. Pendulum was Hey Tonight. Cosmos Factory, Heard It Through the Grapevine. Willie and the Poor Boys was the Midnight Special. Green River, where it got the hardest, in my opinion, was Lodi, but you could pick any of that album. Bayou Country was Born on the Bayou, and CCR, Porterville. If there could only be one, Jason, and I have hummed and hawed about this for near a week, I think it has to be Lodi from Green River. Because when you take every one of CCR's hallmarks, put them all together in a song, on an album that I would say if someone wants the intro to CCR, where they came from, and then their best one, I would tell them to listen to Green River and then Cosmo. And I would tell them Green River first, and I would tell them Lodi.
I'm probably going to get hate mail for this one, but I'm going to say it anyways, because this is actually the second time that we have had a chance to talk about the song Lodi on this show. Of course, go all the way back to our Tesla episode, and that was one of the covers that Tesla did on their 5-man acoustical jam live album, one of the few times that we have actually done a live album on this show. Whenever I think of Lodi, the Tesla version is the song I hear in my head, not the original.
If this wasn't for your podcast, I would sign off of this call right now.
Oh, dear God. Lyle, where'd you go?
No. This isn't unforgivable, but it's about as close as you can get. How could just no one can make an improvement on Fogarty.
Okay.
Nobody can make an improvement.
I ask you, have you listened to 5-Man Acoustical Jam, the album?
I have. I haven't listened to the whole album, but I have definitely listened to their live version of Lodi.
And tell me it's not fun.
It's really good. It's really, really good and really fun. It's a great cover, but you can't beat the classics. And this is the definition of a classic.
Maybe it's just 80s hair metal me that's still talking.
Could be. It could be.
All right. But going through my list here, off of the debut album, I went with Walk on the Water. From Bayou Country, I went with Proud Mary. From Green River, I went with There's a Bathroom on the Right. Bad Moon Rising. From Willie and the Poor Boys, I went with Down on the Corner. Off of Cosmos Factory, I went with Traveling Band. From Pendulum, I went with Have You Ever Seen the Rain? And off of Mardi Gras, I went with Sweet Hitchhiker. But if there can only be one, and it can't be Ooby Dooby, I'm going to go with Have You Ever Seen the Rain? And again, it's one of those things where of all the CCR songs that I have played live, and there's been a few. Like, I was surprised at how many, I think of bands that I have covered. I think CCR may be the one I've covered at least the most variety of songs as opposed to played the most. But Have You Ever Seen the Rain? Every time it's on the set list, I gear up. I freaking love that song.
And it's one of these things that you could pick a lot of songs and I wouldn't necessarily like hold it against you. There's so much quality here that everyone's going to have their own version of, no, this is the best one. But Have You Ever Seen the Rain and Fortunate Son are probably the two that the most people know out of their catalog. I wouldn't say that's a stretch. Fortunate Son's most definitely number one, but next to it, I think Have You Ever Seen the Rain is both a better song than Fortunate Son and also the most universally known.
Lyle, thank you so much for this. Before we go, please let our listeners know what you're up to and where they can find you out there on the interwebs.
You can hear me on 640 Toronto. I am one of the content producers there. Listen to Let's Talk with Danny Stover, and you'll hear some of my musings about the random things happening in the city.
All right, man. You know there's always an open chair, although you may not want to come back after I made that Tesla Lodi comment.
We're just going to save it till after the show. We'll talk after the show.
I'm going to get my ass kicked. Lyle, thank you so much. And to you, our listeners, thank you. Now, you guys know the drill. If there is an artist or a band out there that you want us to cover, hit us up on social media at OnlyOneCast or go to our website at notthatbadcast.com. And while you're there, make sure you check out all of our other shows. Until next time, he's Lyle. I'm Jay. You guys are awesome. This is There Can Only Be One, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network, available also on live365.com and on the app. Take care.
What would you do to achieve the American dream? The big house, the happy family, the money.
911, what's your emergency?
Would you put in the hours? Would you take a big swing?
What's the problem? What's the problem?
Would you lie? Would you cheat?
Were they shot? Were they shot?
Would you kill?
Yes. My mom is dead. My mom is right there.
From Airship, the studio behind American Scandal, comes a new true crime history podcast. I'm Jeremy Schwartz, and I'll be taking you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side of the American dream. In my new show, American Criminal, you'll meet the picture-perfect brothers who'd kill their parents, the thief who stole babies, the crypto king who siphoned off billions, and plenty more. From assassins and gangsters to killers and con artists. Whatever the case, whoever the criminal, you don't know the full story. Until now. Don't miss the debut season of American Criminal, The Menendez Brothers, beginning February 29th. Listen wherever you get your podcasts, or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.